Hello there, you're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. This evening I'd like to talk about the etiological function of myth. And by that I mean it's used to explain the origins of certain practices, certain ideas, certain ways of life. And to do that, I'm going to look specifically at 6 ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures and just draw a single element from each of them and kind of connect them along and sort of walk through the changes here in a particular set of ideas dealing with, well, destruction in a response to degeneration, to problems in the way that people behave towards one another. And the reason for this is that while all cultures come up with their own ideas, they have their own innovations, there are always things that move from place to place and time to time, that pass along, that are picked up through trade, through contact, that diffuse from one place to the next, that show a bit of common cultural DNA. Things change over time within a particular area as cultures rise and fall, as they evolve. And ideas also move around a bit. And every time an idea moves from one place to the next, it always changes. It takes on some new distinct elements that fit the new cultural context in which it's being introduced. And to show some of the differences between those cultural contexts, I'm going specifically to look at destruction myths. And even more specifically than that, most of these, not all but most, will actually have to do with the idea of a flood, of water wiping things out. And in doing that, we'll see some of the commonalities, some of the differences as the idea adapts from one place to the next over long periods of time. And one key thing that you'll see in all of these is a reflection of the physical environment. A reflection of the geography, shall we say. Because some places are easier to live in than others. People have a tendency, or had a tendency, to ascribe some of those conditions to their relationship to gods, to nature, to the universe around them. That whether or not life was difficult had a great deal of impact on how you viewed the malevolence or beneficence of the gods. So, to deal with that, let's start off in a place that's, well, quite easy to live in antiquity. Let's start in Egypt. With each of these, to show the physical relationships, I'll also cut in a map. So here is a map showing you the location of Egypt relative to the other civilizations that we're going to talk about here. And I'll introduce the map each time as I move from place to place so you can see how far apart they are from one another. But we'll also see how far apart they are in time, because I'll give you a sense of that with dating. So let's put things approximately 2700 BCE. That would be about 4,700 years ago or so. And to understand something about Egypt in antiquity, you have to understand just how nice it is to live along the Nile Valley. Just as in antiquity, still today, the vast majority of the population of modern Egypt live in the Nile Valley. And even with the massive population growth that the contemporary world has seen, and the, 82 million some people that live in Egypt, Egypt would still be self-sufficient in terms of food if it wasn't for large amounts of that land being set aside for cash crops or for cattle. So you can imagine just how productive it was in the ancient world. In fact, Egypt only has 3 seasons in their ancient calendar. This is a desert environment after all. And the seasons are all based around the river. You had a deluge season where the Nile's waters rise precipitously, bringing with it tons of rich red silts from farther down in sub-Saharan Africa, and then depositing them all along both banks of the Nile. As the waters recede, you can just throw out your seed and food will grow. It's actually an astonishingly easy place for farming to take root and to be practiced. And people in antiquity were well aware of this. The Egyptian civilization is often called the gift of the Nile for a reason. That the Nile's easy fertility allowed a complex civilization there to develop. Now, in any civilization, you still are going to develop certain religious rituals, certain observances, certain traditions. In Egypt's case, since it politically unifies much sooner than other ancient cultures in the area, they are going to need to be able to justify the power of the central temples, the power of the pharaoh and his religious office. So the etiological myths, by which we mean origin myths, the origin of these practices and ideas, are going to take into account that this is an easy place to live and give a certain amount of thanks for that. But am I not here talking about destruction myths? So let's bring some destruction into it. There is a noted absence of flood-based myths in Egypt, primarily because the Nile was so predictable that they literally set the calendar according to its behavior. So destruction will not come in the most ancient myths via the river. Instead, it comes via the goddess Hathor. And in this particular form of Hathor, she transforms into Sekhmet, a killing beast, and rampages through the countryside, slaughtering people, tearing them from limb to limb like a giant cat, devouring corpses. And the gods that had initially unleashed Sekhmet on the population were doing so because they did not think the people were sufficiently thankful for the gift of the Nile. They were not sufficiently giving thanks and offerings to the gods in exchange for the good life that they had. So Sekhmet was the punishment for their taking advantage or taking it all for granted. And after this went on for a little while, they started to worry, well, I think, how do you stop her? She's just going to destroy everything. She'll destroy the whole world. And that was the way the myth is intended to be understood, which does make it similar to the flood myths, which are, generally discussed as destroying the world, as wiping out all the known world. So to stop Sekhmet, what they did, the Egyptians actually had a god of beer. The beer was a common drink in the ancient Near East, and what they did was they brewed a massive batch of beer and then made it blood colored, so that she would think that it was blood, that she was devouring more of the flesh of humanity. And instead, she drank tons and tons of beer and got thoroughly drunk and, of course, passed out. And when she passed out, she was able to recover her senses, become Hathor again, and the crisis is averted. The reason this myth is significant is that it gives us an origin story for the ritual practices of ancient Egypt with respect to their gods. They worship the gods so that this does not happen ever again. So, one down. Let's move forward just slightly in time, and let's set up a myth in ancient Sumeria. So here is our map, and on the map you can see Mesopotamia is the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the earliest civilizations, the earliest peoples here that actually progressed to full cities are in the far south. And as they moved into the period of literacy, we call that Sumer. So our ancient Sumerian civilization, we're going to date this story to about 2100 BCE, so a little over 4100 years ago. One thing to note right away about the Mesopotamian environment, which will affect both the Sumerians and the later Akkadians and all the other peoples who settle in this area, is that this is a much more harsh environment in which to live. This is a much more complex environment in which to live, which means that Mesopotamian civilizations will actually be far more dynamic than Egypt will. Egypt will come to value permanence and stability because life is so predictable there. In Mesopotamia, they had to innovate constantly in order to tame the two mighty rivers that pass through the territory, in order to avoid destructive floods. So, out of that harsh environment, we can actually see a physical manifestation of the ancient flood myths, a possible physical origin for it. At the city of Ur, there is a massive silt layer, 11 feet deep, right? And this tells us that at some point in antiquity, right, about 4,000 years ago, the Euphrates had flooded to such an extent and delivered so much soil from farther upstream in Anatolia and dumped so much of this stuff there that it wiped out the city, that it buried the city completely. It literally destroyed it, and then they had to rebuild afterwards. So there may have been an attempt to understand this. And we can see that in possibly the greatest work of ancient literature that goes this far back, the first work of its kind in existence, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or Bilgamesh in the Sumerian form. And in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, since I'm not going to talk about the epic as a whole, we're only dealing with these destruction myths, in the 11th tablet it deals with a destruction of the world. The people of the earth have gotten the earth is too populous, it's too noisy, they're causing too much problems, and it's upsetting the gods, so the god Enlil decides to wipe them out, to clear up the world and basically start over, so that he can sleep better. And to do this, he settles on a massive flood. And in the story, a figure named Zisundra was warned by Enki, the god of the sea and of fresh waters, and the god of the waters, that this was coming and that he should build a boat. Zisundra is actually called Utnapishtim in the later Akkadian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, so most translations actually use that form of the name, since most of our sources for it are later documents. But Zisundra builds his boat, gets the people inside it, and they survive. And as a reward for this, he and his wife are granted immortality for their services in repopulating the earth. I can only imagine how many kids they had to have in order to repopulate the earth after such a destruction. What this reflects, though, is a much more pessimistic view of the environment, that nature could reach out at any moment and cause tremendous destruction, that it could wipe us all out. And it gave us a sense that the gods were capricious, that the gods are cruel. You see this in Enlil simply deciding to wipe people out because he couldn't sleep. In the later Akkadian civilization, and here I'll show you the map again, and you can see that Akkad is just to the north of Sumer. It's built up from a later settlement of Semitic migrants that had come into the area, and these Semitic migrants quickly adopted Sumerian culture, including tons of its basic mythology, its way of life as they settled into the area. So Akkadian civilization, despite being a distinctly different language, represents a tremendous amount of continuity culturally with the Sumerians. And certainly it reflects the same environmental concerns, the same physical geography, since it is still in Mesopotamia between the two rivers. The Atrahasis Epic from the Akkadians reflects the same sort of flood destruction that we see in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this one, it talks about the creation of the world. It gives us a sense of why the world was created in the first place. The gods had been originally the one tasked with building the canals and dikes and whatnot in order to control the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, and the lesser gods were tired of doing this work, so they beseeched the greater gods, can you please create something to do this work for us? Well, that's humanity. Humanity was literally, in this Akkadian conception, created for slave labor, to do the work of taming the rivers. And they proceeded to do so. Well, as they did so, their population shot up again. And they got noisy, and they were partying all the time and making tons of noise, and that was keeping Enlil awake. So you see this idea carries over directly from the Sumerians. Enlil decides to wipe people out, and he tries a few earlier things like pestilence and plague ideals, and that doesn't work. So he decides, well, a great flood will do it. I'll wipe all the people out with a great flood, and he does so. And again, you see the same sort of idea. Atrahasis is warned of this by the god of the fresh waters and told to build a boat, and he does so and saves his family and can repopulate the earth. Again, what we see these two having in common is a reflection of the extremely harsh environment, which gives you a very pessimistic view of the gods and your relationship to the gods, and of the ferocity of nature. Right, the malevolence of nature and the need to appease it. So here again we have an etiological myth, an origin myth for the rituals of sacrifice used to palliate the gods so that they do not visit such destruction again. The ancient Mesopotamians were determined to avoid another cataclysmic deluge to destroy their civilization. So they took to sacrifices to the gods. All right, I want to move from Mesopotamia now and move us to a midway point between them in what is called the Fertile Crescent. So I'll put our map back up. Here's our map. And you can see that the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean area, is directly in between Egypt and Mesopotamia, meaning it is in between two great and fertile river valleys. This gives rise to the name for the entire region, the Fertile Crescent, connecting the two river valleys with the Levant in the middle. Now, developing here in the Levant will be the Phoenician and Canonic civilization, which also comes from the waves of Semitic migration that also gave birth much earlier to the Akkadian peoples. We can see distinct populations developing that will become the ancestors of the Phoenicians and Canonites as far back as 2000 BCE, well into the Bronze Age, but the area continues to develop all into the Iron Age. And we have a series of myths from the Hebrew peoples, from our Israelite civilizations, our Israelite and Judahite civilizations. And it's very likely that these civilizations, as well as the other peoples nearby them that spoke similar languages, Moab, Edom, all had their origins in the Canaanite civilization, that they emerged out of that and diverged from it steadily because of the development of cultural practices. By about the 8th century BCE, so let's say 700 BCE, we have a distinct civilization having developed amongst the Israelite and Judahite populations. And among them, many of their stories are going to be quite familiar to us. I want to make reference to specifically two of their myths. The first is the creation account that's given at the beginning of Genesis, where Elohim creates the world and populates populates it, puts people as well as the animals, plants, everything else there. So you've all heard of the Adam and Eve story. What you have in the Adam and Eve story is an attempt by the gods to deal with humanity collectively, to deal with them all together. Right? And that's going to change because, of course, they're going to betray God's trust. They're going to violate his rules and eat from the forbidden fruit, and therefore have to be cast out of Eden, cast out of paradise. But God will provide for them still, good lands in which to live. They're not going to be destroyed for what they did until their descendants continue to populate the world, and the world continues to build up in its, shall we say, store of evil. Right? It continues to get darker and darker. People are fighting each other, and God is determined to wipe the slate clean and start over. So we have, by the time we get to the Yahwist source, and like Genesis 6, we have the story of a deluge. And God has decided that he's going to flood the world to rid it of evil and do a reset. So he turns to Noah and asks Noah to build a large boat and to collect the animals and his family, and therefore save himself so that he can repopulate the world afterwards. Now, when this is done, a covenant is established. God is at this point still attempting to deal with all of humanity together, because he gives a set of rules to Noah that are supposed to apply to all people, what's often called the Nauheed Covenant in Judaism. A set of 7 laws that are supposed to apply to all people. This is still not going to work out terribly well, and God will later shift focus and narrow it, and that gives rise to Judaism itself much later with Moses. But at this point, God is still dealing collectively with people and is still trying to solve that basic problem of evil. But you don't have here a sense of the pessimism that's present in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, what we had was a sense of true fatalism, that God does not like us at all, that God can destroy us at any point, and we worshipped God out of pure fear. Right? Please do not destroy my village. Do not send plagues and diseases and whatnot and pestilence. Do not kill us all. Here is a sacrifice. But sacrifice in the Noah story is one of thanks. God has given you a new world to start over. And the environment in which this culture develops is not one prone to floods. It is worth noting here that there is a relationship between Mesopotamia and the Levant, culturally, linguistically, and you can even see this directly in the text with the idea that Abraham originally comes from, Uru the Chaldees, that he comes from Mesopotamia himself. So there is undoubtedly a borrowing of the flood myths here, but without the mighty rivers that Mesopotamia has, the idea of floods just doesn't make a great deal of sense. So what is Noah told? A flood will not come again. As long as you maintain these laws, as long as things are good here, I commit never to doing this again. I put the rainbow in the sky as a sign of my promise never to destroy the world again, that you guys are starting over, starting fresh, and everything's going to work out better this time. So it's a much more optimistic view of God, that you don't have this fear hanging over your head that God can destroy you at any point. Instead, he has committed through this covenant not to do it again. All right. Now, that's let's take a step slightly farther to the west here. Let's move over a bit and look at the ancient Greeks. And here's our map again, and we can see that Greece is really not that far from the Levant. In fact, Greek civilization is intimately tied to the Levant, with the Greek writing system very likely emerging out of the Phoenician/Canonite writing system because of trading colonies and Greek traders, settling next to the Phoenicians there in what is today Lebanon, and their kids growing up bilingual and learning the writing system. The thing that really differentiates the writing system of the Phoenicians with the Greek script is the addition of vowels. Other than that, its earliest origins really are related to it. So there's always been a great deal of connection back and forth that's been maintained throughout, that Greece is in many ways still an Oriental civilization, still a civilization of the ancient Near East, with a tremendous amount of overlap in its ideals, its rituals, its history. And you can see this too, perhaps, in the adoption of certain perspectives. In particular, its pessimism Now, the pessimism can also have a local root, an indigenous origin, shall we say. There is an early Greek story here that you can see contained in Hesiod's Works and Days that talks about the cycles of earlier development of races on the earth. But before that, let's actually create the physical location. Let's create the environment. When the nations of the earth were being built, and you're walking around, and there's a big sack, and it's lay down a river valley here, and lay down a mountain here, and lay down a forest here. By the time they got to Greece, there was nothing left in the bag but rocks, so they dumped out the rocks. Greece is rocky. It's a bunch of cliffs and islands and sharp mountains, not a lot of good arable land here. And that harshness of environment undoubtedly had some kind of impact on their perspective. So if you walk through Hesiod's stories of these earlier ages, you can see a sense of degeneration, a sense of decline that reflects this pessimistic view of nature. There are 5 races in Hesiod's understanding. As you go back to a golden age with a golden race, and a silver age with a silver race, and a bronze one. I'm not going to go into the characteristics of each because they're really not relevant to our story here, other than to note that each one is better than the one that comes after it. So at each stage, there's something worse about it. You're getting more and more toward the sense of of mortality, of suffering that will characterize life for Hesiod. It is, of course, worth noting that the stories of Hesiod, like the stories of Homer, actually go back to the 8th century BCE, so time-wise around the same time that the Hebrew scripture is coming together. And that this is coming out of the Greek Dark Age, that this is coming out of a time when writing, the earliest writing system of the Mycenaeans has been lost, that the complex civilization has been lost, the ability to build cities has been lost, and they're reduced to small-scale tribal life. It's a very harsh life for them, and the stories probably reflect something of the sense that they've lost what they had in the past. There is for Hesiod a bump and in its decline, in the 4th of those 5 races, because he needs to account for an age of heroes. And that's to account for the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They had to be able to understand that this earlier time before them had to have been a time of great heroes. Right, to account for these other stories that are circulating. But by the time the Age of Heroes is over, right, which then could be an oral memory of the Bronze Age collapse and the end of the Mycenaean period, by the time you get to what Hesiod calls the Iron Race, his own time, you're back into this cycle of decline. And there is an understanding that just as with all 4 of the other races, that Zeus will eventually get tired of us, of the Iron Race, and destroy us too. That Zeus will wipe out all life again, as he has repeatedly. So again, this is a profoundly pessimistic view. And it seems to reflect a sense of almost permanent decline. Hesiod argued that at some point a race will appear, one of our successors far beyond us, that will actually be born old, that they won't have any good life at all. There won't be any time of joy, right, that you might have in your youth, right, that we'll all be born with the sufferings and pain of old age. So let's move from here and let's drift a little bit farther west too, again. And also a little bit closer to us in time, let's move to about the 1st century, so only 2,000 years ago, and let's introduce the Romans into our story. I think the Romans are a good one to end on. Here you can see Rome is in the center of the Italian peninsula, and not too far from the rest of our ancient civilizations. It's certainly going to draw tons of inspiration from them. The Greeks had settled all of southern Italy and Sicily, so that's an immediate cultural influence for them. I want to, for the Romans, I want to close with them because it's a much more optimistic view. Right, so here we're bouncing back again from the pessimistic view of the Greeks to something even more optimistic than the Hebrews. When the great Roman poet Ovid included a story in his Metamorphoses of the earlier creation, he's drawing on Hesiod, and he's drawing on Hesiod's five races. But he does it a little differently. Right? And he does it in a way that reflects something of the Roman character and the Roman approach to life. What Ovid does is he starts with a golden race, and then a silver, and a bronze, and then he goes to an iron race. He does not have to have a race of heroes in between, because for him, the Iliad and Odyssey period is even farther back in time. So for him, that can just be the bronze. That can sort of fit into that time period there. And he can continue his decline through each of those four. But for Ovid, we are not the iron race. The iron race has already been destroyed by Jupiter. And we are instead a race of stone. Yeah. Now, why and how are they a race of stone? Let's get back to our original flood ideal, which we've seen in the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the Israelite and Judahite civilizations. So in 3 of the 5 previous ones, we specifically used water to destroy the world. So we'll do that again here. Jupiter will destroy the iron race with a great flood, but he will save Deucalion and Pyrrha. Right, there are 2 of them saved, and they build a boat, as in like Atrahasis and whatnot. They build a boat and they survive, and there's just the 2 of them. And at the end, they're faced with the prospect of repopulating the earth. And like, well, how do we do that? There's only 2 of us, right? How can we possibly repopulate the earth? So they go to the Oracle at Delphi. Which is interesting that the oracle functions even without the Pythia, without like the woman inside of it and the priest to interpret. But let's leave that part out. They go to the Oracle at Delphi, and the oracle tells them, throw the bones of your ancestors over your shoulders. And they're initially like, oh my God, this is horrible. We can't do that. That's a tremendous sacrilege. I'm not going to dig up bones. And wait a minute. What if the bones are the earth itself? So, well, it's worth a try. Let's see what happens. Deucalion and Pyrrha both pick up a bunch of rocks, and they start walking, and they throw stones over their shoulders as they walk. And the stones that Deucalion throws over his shoulder become men, and the stones that Pyrrha throws over her shoulder become women. And we are their descendants. Right? Not directly of Deucalion and Pyrrha through sexuality, but through the people that they created from the stones themselves, from the rocks. Why do you think the Romans did this? It reflects in some sense the Roman character, the sense of toughness of the Romans, right? As well as their optimism that they can get through anything. We're as hard as stone. We can put up with anything. We're a stoic people, and we can rise to any challenge. Come at me. This is something fundamental to the Roman character. So it shows something of the optimism too. Since, again, not only have you gone through these different stages of decline in a sense, but you've actually ended up at an interesting point where you've ended up with a very hardy people. A very tough people who can deal with any kind of possible hardship. All right, what I've tried to show with all these is not only the movement of ideas from place to place, but also how they can explain the origins of the relationships in various rituals. Hopefully this has been helpful in some ways. If you enjoy my little videos, make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you again.